Looking good so far.
It's gonna work.
Finish.
Is that the sign for go, or are we waiting on?
1 second. Let me make sure we're good in there, and I'll pull up Facebook over here. Yeah, we are live on Facebook. You can go.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, guys, for being with us this morning for Coffee with Counsel. We have Stephen Parker here with us from Title Resources, and we hadn't gotten any topics from you guys, so we were trying to pick one. So if somebody has something they want us to talk about, let Diana know on Facebook, and we will do our best to address it off the cuff here. But Stephen and I were visiting yesterday and thought it might be a good opportunity, maybe a little dark topic, but something that we probably need to discuss is what happens if somebody dies during a transaction.
Oh,
what does that do to your transaction, and how do we keep it on the rails as best we can for you? So Stephen, take it away.
Thank you, Amy. First, follow up from last week, we were talking about remote online notarization, and someone asked where if both the signer and the remote online notary have to be in Texas. And I pulled this directly from the statute. The notary must be physically located in Texas, and this is what it says. However, the signing party may be located anywhere. So even if you're on the moon, as long as you have a good internet connection, then we can notarize you as long as our notary is there in Texas. So and that's the remote online notary thing. It came out a couple of years ago. That's where everything's done via a web, and there's a special notary signature that says it's an electronic notarization. But that was just a follow-up from last week. So the signing party can be located anywhere as long as the notary is physically located in Texas. So
perfect. That'll free up a lot of people who are on vacation and need to go to an embassy. So that sounds good.
Right, exactly. But yeah, so the topic today, it depends on how you look at it. We're trying to think of ways to be helpful. But yeah, it is dark, and I admit we came up with it because of what we're dealing with right now. But what do you do in a transaction when the seller or the buyer dies? So you've already entered contract, you haven't closed. I think most people's first response, and maybe not realtors, but could I ask my wife what she thinks happened? She's like, the contract just ends. I'm like, actually, no, that's not what happens. The first thing is, let's look at, there's the shortest answer, and if you've been coming to these coffees with Counsel for a while, you're going to expect this, is the answer is it depends, right? Because there's so many different moving parts, but for starters, let's go with the seller, right? So if a seller dies after contract before closing, although they can't sign the selling documents, their estate can sign the selling documents. So the seller is still obligated, or the seller's estate, if you will, is still obligated under that transaction. Now, a couple of things. The estate might have to go through probate, or maybe there has to be an affidavit of heirship filed showing where the seller's interest went. So the seller is still obligated under the contract, and their estate has to make reasonable attempts to perform under the contract. Sometimes the buyer might not want to wait because there's certain things that, you know, if you have, probate isn't something you can do in a week, right? So if they're going to go through probate, and even if the seller's okay with it, you might have to wait a few months and even just get a judge's permission to sell the property. But it is a possibility, and generally the seller is still on contract and their estate has to fulfill the obligations. Now, if they make a reasonable attempt to fulfill the obligations, generally, and they can't, just for whatever reason, generally the buyer will get their earnest money back. But that's the worst of it, because if you can't perform, you can't perform. However, if your seller makes no attempt to perform and just doesn't want to perform, those are the situations where there have been instances where the buyers actually sues the seller's estate. Regardless of if you win or lose, now sellers dealing with the death of a loved one, their estate, and also dealing with a lawsuit. So I guess my advice if you're advising any of your sellers is, I mean, they have a duty to perform, or at least make all attempts to. And I found a few articles and a few posts from realtors where they've had buyers who were fine with waiting, and they had extended a couple months, but they actually did go through the closing, and the seller's estate sold the property to them. So now on the other side, the buyer, it's a little bit trickier. The legal rule is the buyer has to perform, or the buyer's estate has to perform, as long as all contingencies are taken care of. Now, what does that mean? It basically means that if the buyer has done everything the buyer has to do in order to perform under that contract, and the buyer passes away, then his estate would be responsible for completing the contract. Now, one of the contingencies could be a loan, right? Well, the lender is not going to give a loan to a dead person, right? So that right away, for example, that would mess up a transaction. But there's some examples, cash transaction. The buyer did everything they were supposed to do. All the contingencies have been performed under the contract, and they were just kind of waiting for the closing date to happen. In those situations, the buyer is still obligated, or their estate is still obligated to go through with the contract. Based on the shortest answer is, if it's a seller, you could probably get them their estate to perform. A buyer, it's going to be a little bit trickier, just because there's so many different things that have to be done. I think the biggest thing though is that, the loan, right? If the buyer's getting a loan and they're not there, obviously you can't get a loan anymore. They don't have the physical capability to go through with the contract. So that's the biggest difference right there. But it is interesting, because I think a lot of people think contracts just terminate upon the death of someone, and unless it's written that way, that's not necessarily. The estate still has a duty to perform, which, if you think about it, that makes sense with a lot of contracts. For example, a deed of trust, when you buy a house, the lender still gets their money, either through selling the house or one way or the other after you pass. So they settle that up in probate court. So, but anyway, that's it in a nutshell. Are there any questions based on what I've said so far?
Not on Facebook. Kathy, do you have any questions? You're muted.
Yeah. I love the background.
Sorry. Okay.
I don't think we have any questions so far. I think that's pretty clear.
Dan, have you ever seen that or dealt with that, or with one of your realtors? Or
I haven't had somebody die during the transaction. I've dealt with some where the estate is selling, but not somebody dying during the transaction, although I've heard horror stories.
Right. Well, and that's a good point. A lot of times the estate might want to be selling anyway, right? So if that happens, it's in their best interest that, hey, we're going to have to find a buyer for this anyway. Let's go ahead and get this done and try to follow through with it. The only thing I could think where it didn't happen is maybe if the house was going to a child that didn't want to leave their home, their parents' home or something. But for the most part, I think that's what happens anyway. So it might make it easier.
Yeah.
Did someone have something, or is that a TV?
I think it's a TV.
Okay.
Probably.
So yeah, that's the topic I had today. We can get into on a different time or now or whatever, like what happens when you own real estate and you pass, and that's the whole, whether it goes through probate or affidavit of heirship or the heirs who it goes to, that type stuff. And if you're familiar with that at all, I did a class on that, I think last year with you guys. That can be a sticky situation depending on, unless it's just husband and wife and kids of their marriage, which is pretty straightforward. That could be a sticky situation as well, which might be another reason why it might take a while for the seller's estate to be able to sell. But we can do that at a different time. But it just shows that it can be done, but might not be as quickly as the buyers want. But if they're willing to wait, I'm sure you can make it work.
And that's what I talk about when you're in a transaction. If there's been a death recently, to be sure your title provider knows that, so we can be asking the right questions, so we don't get to the 11th hour and then find out there's a problem, because nearly everything can be fixed. It just sometimes takes time, and so don't want to get you off the tracks there if we can help it. So
Yeah, we don't like last minute surprises. I've heard horror stories of a seller came in and a lady came with him and it was his wife. He got married the weekend before in Vegas and that changed everything, right? And
Yeah.
okay, that changes everything. So
Don't get married. Don't buy a car. Don't co-sign a lease.
yeah, don't do anything. Freeze. Freeze until it's done.
Right. Don't change jobs.
We've had that happen too. It's yeah, and then it's our fault when it's like, well, actually the lender won't give you the loan now because you just started a new job, even though everyone told you not to. So
Right. So talk about maybe the difference between if a person dies with a will or without a will. Is there a difference in how fast that can go forwards?
So the difference, so with the will or without a will, I guess, so with the will is called probate, and with, or testate, and without a will is intestate. And the thing that a lot of people fail to realize is just because you die, so you die with a will and then you have 4 years to probate it. If you don't probate it within those 4 years, I tell people all the time, if you don't probate within the will within the 4 years, then you basically died without a will. And in that situation, you have to go to the Texas statute as far as where the interest fell. So with the will, it's straightforward. You probate the will tells us exactly who you were leaving everything to. So once it's probated and you get in front of a judge and they admit the will to probate, then that tells us exactly who the sellers will be. Now that process might be a month or two. If they know that there's a pending transaction, maybe we can just get, depending on the debts, the property released to do a sell from the executor of the estate. So it might even be before probate's finished. And that could be, a month or two, you might be waiting on the court. Without a will, then you're looking at someone that's dying intestate, and for title policies or purposes, we have to show, I guess, leave a paper trail, if you will, of where that property went. And the way we do that is with an affidavit of heirship. An affidavit of heirship is signed by someone that is inheriting the property, and then two disinterested witnesses that can attest to that information. Generally, the rule is when someone, because they could still have debts, when someone passes, the general rule is we like to wait 6 months. Obviously, in that situation, we could get an exception from our underwriter, and whether we could get an exception, a lot of it just depends on, I guess, the family tree, if you will. If there's a lot of heirs out there and the decedent had been married several times and has several different kids from different marriages, it might make it a little bit trickier. Whereas if it was just, like I said, decedent and he'd been married once and he had kids from that marriage, or even if he had no kids, it makes it a little bit easier. A lot of it just depends on how much the estate split upon their death based on who their heirs are. But an affidavit of heirship doesn't take long at all. We'd have to get an exception. So if it's pretty straightforward, that might even be a faster way. And you might have people electing not to probate the will for that reason, if the will matches what Texas and testate laws say where the heirship would go, or the interest. But yeah, good question. A month or two either way, and testate could be a little bit faster depending on how clean the family tree is, if you will.
All right. You have any questions, Kathy?
No, I mean, I've had issues with, with the survey, and of course with, and you try. I had one where there was an estate, there was no will, and there was a lien on there, and my buyer was determined to buy it, and so that lien was not coming off, and supposedly, like in a few years, it was going to drop off. I don't remember what the issue was. They couldn't get a hold of the company in order to, for it to drop off. So what we did is, since he was paying cash anyway, then he went ahead and bought it without a title policy.
Oh,
but
wow.
That was, I said, you really want this? Because the title company's not going to cover it. They close on it, but I mean, he bought it without a title policy. So
Did he buy it without a title policy or buy it subject to that lien? Do you know?
I don't remember, it was years ago,
Okay.
but I know that the title company was not going to, and there was something, I know that we got something in writing saying that the lien was going to drop off after so long or something
Yeah.
like that. So it was such a drop off in a few years, but they couldn't, they just couldn't get anybody, get a hold, I don't know.
Yeah, no,
Like I said,
no.
this is when I was living in Tyler. So, so it's one of those like,
So
yeah, I tried
so
him to buy something else and he wanted that house. So,
sounds like a deed of trust. If you put a maturity date on it, then 4 years after the maturity date, it can no longer be enforced. And so if the deed of trust had a maturity date on it and had been, and they were coming up on 4 years, then it could have been that type of situation where it wouldn't, quote, fall off, but those aren't ones that concern us if we can't find the release, because no one can enforce that because it's more than 4 years past the maturity date listed on the deed of trust, which if you're preparing documents, sometimes that's a reason not to put a maturity date on it. But in that situation, that probably helped your buyer.
Yeah. So, I mean, when we looked at our options, that's the only option we had. And he didn't want to look at another house. So that's what we did.
Well, I'm sure it turned out fine. I imagine he got a title policy and there was just an exception to that document.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
I'm not seeing anything on Facebook, but I did just post, does anybody have any questions on any topic? So we'll see.
Okay. How are y'all doing? How's y'all's business? Do you feel like it's starting to pick back up? Do you feel like it's starting to slow down? Is it about the same?
Mine hasn't stopped because I'm basically doing the work of 3 agents, because 2 agents that I work with are kind of like, Melissa has health issues, so she sets up showings for me and I go. And then there's another agent in a different company. She has lupus, so same thing. She said she's been sending tons of leads. So I'm glad that I'm healthy and continue to be healthy. So it's those precautions. I mean, I have the gloves, the masks, the wipies. I had, thanks to my housekeeper. It's so long a story. I'm just gonna try to cut it short. But one day she was cleaning and she said, we're out of wipes. So of course I went and I bought some, and I bought the 3-pack, and then I put them out. So the next time I said we're out of wipes, again, I went and bought 3-pack, and then I saw that, oh, we've got plenty here. So, whenever all of this happened, I had tons of wipies, and of course I always buy toilet paper in bulk. So everybody was running out of toilet paper and I was fine.
Good.
So this is normal for me, except for being a little bit busier than normal. So.
Well, that's good. The consensus I've talked to, a lot of people in real estate are still busy, whether it's the refinances or the buyers and the sellers. I feel like there was a pause for a little bit. No one canceled anything, but what we saw is people were extending contracts for about 30 days to see what happens. And then now the people that were wanting to buy are, they're like, let's buy. And people that are wanting to sell, in my neighborhood alone, I saw 2 new for sale signs this week because, it's summer. Schools, my kids basically, I'm at Keller ISD. They have 2 more weeks of online school, but it's that time of year where you start moving, right? So it's unless it's someone that's been affected by loss of a job, so they're not able to get a loan. I think sellers are still willing to sell and buyers are still willing to buy. And luckily we haven't seen any of that. And I hope you guys haven't either.
No, and I'm hearing kind of an interesting last week. I was talking to some of our agents that work maybe further out, Decatur, Wise, Grayson, Montague, and they are actually busier than they've ever been. A lot of people are moving out of the city and into more rural areas. And so they're actually more busy than normal.
You think that's a reaction because of the pandemic?
Yeah. They do think it's because of that.
Wow. I know the trend for a while has been going back to the cities.
Find a better deal.
Yeah, you'll find a better deal further out as well. But yeah, that's the interesting thing that I was finding last week when I was calling the agents.
Yeah, we some of the builders in Dallas, they were all still building, but then for a little bit, Dallas wasn't sending anyone out to issue permits anymore. So that's a indirect way how that could affect all of us, as far as that industry. It's the agents are selling, the title companies are closing, the builders are building. But if the city of Dallas, wouldn't send out someone to give a permit, now we can't, it stopped everything. And I think that may have, for a while, we thought that could have impacted us more, but we haven't noticed that. And I don't know whether they've gone back to that or not, but they just weren't doing inspections type stuff. So, but I also talked to a builder in Tarrant County the other day, and he said, used to, we would go out and walk the property together, me and give them the inspections, and it's a little bit different now. I send them the plans, and then the person from the county or the city just walks it themselves and emails me back approval. So they're finding workarounds to make it work.
Yeah. Well, I know we just transmitted and we did good last month. So I'm sure May not stacking up so well with April. I don't know. I haven't seen numbers yet, but everything we do is 30, 60, 90 days out. So I'm sure we might see a little bit. I mean, this is May, so this is when everybody wants to put their house on the market to move over the summer. So we may not see as much as if it had happened in like November. That would have killed the end of the year.
Sure, because that slows down anyway. Yeah, true.
Yeah. So, well, I'm not seeing anything on Facebook, so if we don't have any other questions, we could probably call it for today.
All right. Well, if you think of anything, let us know. Next one will be in 2 weeks.
Yes.
Diana, I appreciate you setting it up and sending the links and hosting, and that makes it easier on us when all I have to do is click a link and smile. So.
Yes. All right. Well, thanks for coming and giving us some great information.
You're welcome. You have a good day.
Bye. Have a good day.
Bye.